Professor Gonim is looking at something on her monitor that does not make immediate sense. She is at her desk in the Space and Drone Remote Sensing Laboratory at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and the image on the screen is a processed radar backscatter map of the Nile Valley west of Cairo, a false color representation of the different ways that microwave energy is reflecting off the buried subsurface of the Egyptian landscape. She has processed thousands of images like this over her career. She knows what different types of subsurface geology look like in radar backscatter. She knows what buried sand dunes look like, and what ancient shorelines look like, and what the remains of dried up lake beds look like, because she has spent years finding exactly these things in radar data from across the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula. What she is looking at now is a river. The image shows a clear, continuous linear feature with the specific radar signature of water, deposited sediments, the characteristic backscatter pattern of fluvial silts and sorted channel sands that distinguish a former riverbed from the surrounding geology. The feature is broad, hundreds of meters across in its widest sections. It is continuous over long distance, maintaining a consistent orientation and a consistent radar signature across its entire mapped extent. It is, by every criterion she knows for identifying ancient buried rivers in radar data, unmistakably a river, a major one that was large enough and active long enough to deposit the sediment signature that the radar is now reflecting back at her satellite 60 feet above the ground. And it is running directly alongside the pyramids of the Western Desert Plateau. The specific emotional response that this realization produces is one that scientists rarely describe in print. The shock of understanding that an extremely old problem has just found its answer, and that the answer was buried in the ground the whole time, invisible to everyone who came before because none of them had the instrument that would reveal it. Gonim has been working in remote sensing of ancient landscapes long enough to know what this moment means. She has found lost rivers before. None of them mattered quite like this one. The river she is looking at, the one that will eventually be named the Ahramat branch from the Arabic word for pyramids, is the answer to a question that Egyptology has been asking since Napoleon's scholars first encountered the pyramid fields in 1798 and immediately recognized that something about the pyramid's location did not add up. Why were 31 major Egyptian pyramids the largest concentration of pyramid architecture anywhere in the world, built on an apparently random stretch of desert plateau that today is not close to any navigable water, not adjacent to any obvious natural resources, not conveniently accessible from the Nile that was the geographical backbone of Egyptian civilization? Why here? The answer, it turns out, has been sitting 60 feet below the agricultural fields of the Nile floodplain, in the form of 64 kilometers of buried fluvial sediment that a radar satellite can see, and a human standing on the surface cannot. To understand why this discovery is genuinely transformative, why it resolves not just one mystery, but the entire geographic logic of the pyramid building program, it is necessary to understand both the technology that found the river and the specific problem that the river's existence solves. The radar satellite technology that Gonim used belongs to the family of instruments known as synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. The technology is based on the same physical principle as conventional microwave radar. Transmit a pulse of microwave energy toward the target, measure the intensity and timing of the reflected signal, and build an image from those measurements. What makes SAR different from conventional radar, and what makes it extraordinarily useful for archaeological remote sensing, is the way it synthesizes a much larger effective antenna by combining measurements made as the satellite moves along its orbital path. This synthesis produces much finer spatial resolution than a physical antenna of the same size could achieve, allowing SAR satellites to produce images with resolution sufficient to detect geological and archaeological features at the scale of tens of meters from an orbital altitude of hundreds of kilometers. The specific property of SAR that matters most for finding buried rivers is its sensitivity to the texture and moisture content of the subsurface. Microwave energy penetrates into dry, sandy soil and reflects off the denser, more electrically conductive material below. In desert environments where the surface is covered by dry, electrically transparent sand, SAR satellites can effectively see through the sand layer to the substrate beneath, producing images that reflect subsurface geology rather than surface appearance. This is the same effect that led to the serendipitous discovery, using the Space Shuttle's imaging radar in 1981, of ancient river channels buried beneath the hyper-arid sands of the eastern Sahara in Sudan, a discovery that revealed that rivers flowing across what is now absolute desert had existed within the past several million years. The agricultural plain of the Nile Valley presents a different but related challenge. The cultivated fields of the floodplain are not dry desert sand. They are moist, worked agricultural soil whose surface layer has been mixed and modified by millennia of plowing and irrigation. But the deeper layers below, the reach of agricultural activity, preserve the original sediment sequence of the ancient landscape. And it is these deeper layers that the SAR signal reaches when the geometric and technical conditions are right. By selecting specific frequency bands and incidence angles that optimize subsurface penetration in the specific geological conditions of the Nile Valley, Ghonem's team was able to extract subsurface information from the agricultural plain that was as informative as the subsand imagery from desert environments. The result was a subsurface map of the Nile Valley west of the modern river that showed for the first time the ghost of the ancient drainage system that had shaped the landscape before the Saharan drying process, and the Nile's gradual eastward migration erased it from the surface. The Ahramat branch was the largest and most continuous feature in this ghost drainage map. Its radar signature was consistent from north to south along its 64-kilometer mapped course, maintaining the specific backscatter characteristics of a major river channel. The combination of fine-grained silts from the floodplain, coarser sands from the active channel, and the characteristic horizontal lamination of water-deposited sediments that distinguished it clearly from the surrounding geology. The ground-truthing phase of the research, the process of confirming that the radar interpretation corresponds to real subsurface geology, involved two independent lines of investigation. Geophysical surveys using electrical resistivity tomography and ground-penetrating radar were conducted along profiles crossing the mapped Ahramat branch channel. These surveys independently confirmed the radar satellite interpretation. The subsurface in the channel zone showed the electrical properties of fine-grained water-deposited sediments with significantly different resistivity values from the surrounding geological units. The boundary between the channel fill and the surrounding geology was sharp and well-defined in the geophysical data, consistent with the lateral boundaries of a river channel rather than the gradational transitions of wind-blown or otherwise diffusely distributed sediment. The sediment coring phase produced the most definitive confirmation. Hollow core tubes were driven into the ground at multiple locations distributed along the mapped channel course, extracting cylinders of sediment from depths of up to 8 meters. The cores from channel locations contained sequences of fine-grained silts and clays alternating with coarser channel sands, the specific vertical sediment sequence that geomorphologists expect in a river channel that becomes progressively less energetic as its flow decreases over time. The silts contained pollen and plant fragments consistent with riparian vegetation, the plants that grow along riverbanks, and the sediment mineralogy was consistent with upstream sources in the Nile drainage basin, confirming that the material had been transported by flowing water from elsewhere rather than deposited locally by wind. Optically stimulated luminescence, dating of quartz grains from the sediment cores provided age estimates for when the sediments were deposited. The technique measures the accumulated radiation dose in quartz grains, a dose that builds up at a known rate while the grain is buried and shielded from light, and that resets when the grain is exposed to sunlight. The age of last light exposure, corresponding to the time when the grain was last transported on the surface before being buried as river sediment, provides a minimum age for when the river was actively flowing. The OSL ages from cores along the Ahramat branch place the active river period during the Old and Middle Kingdom eras of Egyptian history, the period from approximately 2700 BCE through approximately 1150 BCE, during which the 31 pyramids along the branch's course were built. The overlap between the active river period and the pyramid construction period was not a close call. The sediment ages span the complete range of the pyramid building program, from the earliest 3rd Dynasty pyramids at the northern end of the chain through the Middle Kingdom pyramids at Lisht and Dashur at the southern end. The Ahramat branch was flowing at its maximum navigable depth and width during the Old Kingdom, the era of the great 4th Dynasty pyramids at Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur that represent the peak of Egyptian pyramid architecture. It was already beginning to shallow and periodically dry during the Middle Kingdom, but remained at least partially navigable for the construction of the later pyramids in the chain. The relationship between the Ahramat branch and the physical architecture of the pyramid complexes is where the discovery moves from a geological confirmation to architectural revelation. Each of the major pyramid complexes consists of the pyramid itself, a mortuary temple. Immediately adjacent to it, a long enclosed causeway running downslope from the mortuary temple, and a valley temple at the base of the plateau where the causeway terminates. This 4-part architectural formula has been the standard Egyptological understanding of Old Kingdom pyramid complex design for over a century. What has not been adequately explained is the function of the valley temple and the spatial logic of the causeway orientation. The valley temples are substantial buildings. Khafre's Valley Temple at Giza is one of the best preserved Old Kingdom buildings in Egypt, a massive structure of pink Aswan granite and white Tura limestone, with interior corridors lined with the famous diorite statues of Khafre that were found in a pit in its floor. It is a building of extraordinary quality and considerable scale. functioning as a purely ceremonial gateway to the pyramid complex. As it has traditionally been described, it seems disproportionately elaborate for its apparent purpose. Functioning as a river harbor, a facility for receiving boats, unloading construction materials, processing ritual objects, and offerings arriving by water, and providing dignified access to the pyramid complex for official visitors arriving by boat. It makes complete sense. Its orientation, its foundation depth, its relationship to the causeway that leads from it to the pyramid, its proximity to the Ahrimat branch, as now mapped. All of these features are coherent and proportionate when the building is understood as a harbor facility rather than a ceremonial doorway. The causeway from Khafra's Valley Temple to his pyramid runs approximately 494 meters, at a consistent upward gradient that would allow loaded sledges to be pulled from the harbor to the construction site with manageable effort. The orientation of the causeway, its compass bearing, its relationship to the topography of the plateau, is aligned with the position of the Ahrimat branch, precisely where the branch would have been navigable at the depth needed for the transport barges carrying Aswan granite. The causeways of the other major pyramid complexes show the same pattern. Each runs from the Valley Temple at the base of the plateau, directly toward the Ahrimat branch, at a gradient and orientation optimized for the movement of heavy materials from the water's edge to the construction site. The quantitative logistics that the Ahrimat branch enables can be illustrated by considering the problem of the Aswan granite. The 9 ceiling beams of the King's Chamber in Khufu's Great Pyramid weigh between 25 and 80 tons each. Aswan, where granite was quarried, is approximately 800 kilometers south of Giza by the Nile's course. Moving an 80-ton granite block from Aswan to Giza without water transport is not merely difficult, it is effectively impossible without mechanized assistance. Moving it by boat down the Nile from Aswan to the point where the Ahrimat branch intersected the main river and then west along the branch to the Valley Temple Harbor at the base of Khufu's. Causeway is an entirely feasible operation for the barge technology of the Old Kingdom. The boats that made this journey are documented, not just in Merer's papyri, but in the boat pits adjacent to the Great Pyramid itself, where the full-size cedarwood boat of Khufu was found preserved in its sealed pit in 1954. The logistics of pyramid construction, reassembled with the Ahrimat branch restored to the geographic picture, are coherent and efficient rather than bafflingly difficult. The evidence linking the branch to the construction operations specifically, rather than to later use of the branch for other purposes, comes from several archaeological features that align spatially with the mapped channel course. At multiple pyramid sites, stone-lined channels and basin features have been identified in the archaeological record that appear to connect the Valley Temple to the branch. These features, partial remnants of the quay walls, and loading platforms that would have served the river harbor function, are consistent with the positions of the branch as mapped by the satellite survey, providing a physical connection between the architectural features of the pyramid complex and the hydrological feature that the satellite has found. The specific case of Khufu's pyramid and the documentation in Merer's diary deserves extended treatment, because Merer's papyri provide a real-time operational perspective on the supply chain that the Ahrimat branch was part of. Merer's team of approximately 200 men was responsible for transporting Tura limestone casing blocks from the quarries on the east bank of the Nile to the Giza construction site. His diary records the specific route. The blocks were loaded onto barges at Tura, taken across the Nile, and transported along a canal system to the Giza site. The Canal of Khufu, mentioned in the papyri, the specific waterway that brought blocks to the Giza site, is now interpretable in the context of the Ahrimat branch as a connecting canal between the main Nile and the Ahrimat branch, or alternatively as a section of the branch itself that was maintained and managed as a navigable channel by the Royal Construction Administration. The reference in Merer's papyri to the Akhet horizon of Khufu, the gleaming casing of white limestone that reflected the desert sun, and gave the pyramid its name as a horizon feature, identifies the casing stones as coming from Tura on every trip Merer's team made. The Tura limestone for the casing of the Great Pyramid made a journey of approximately 15 kilometers from the Tura quarry across the Nile to the Giza site. The most efficient path for this journey, given the known geography of the ancient landscape and the now confirmed existence of the Ahrimat branch, involved the Nile-to-branch connection at a point north of Giza, transit along the branch to the Giza Valley Temple Harbor, and then the uphill haul along Khufu's causeway to the construction site. Merer's team completed this round trip approximately every 10 days for the period covered by his diary. Multiplied across the construction period and across all the teams making similar journeys for different materials, the Ahrimat branch was an extraordinarily busy waterway. A superhighway, as Ghonim herself described it to National Geographic, for the materials and personnel that built the pyramids. The geology of the branch's eventual disappearance is now documented in some detail by the sediment core data. The cores show a progressive transition from high-energy river sediments, coarse sands and gravels characteristic of vigorous water flow, to fine silts and clays characteristic of slow, meandering or ponded water, and then to dry, wind-blown sediment deposited after the river ceased flowing. This stratigraphics. Progression records the dying of the Ahrimat branch over time, driven by the combination of forces that the research team has identified: the long-term drying of the Saharan climate that reduced the Nile's headwater contribution, the tectonic subsidence that tilted the valley slightly eastward, accelerating the migration of the active channels away from the western desert plateau, and the accumulation of wind-blown sand that gradually encroached into the abandoned channel from the Saharan desert to the west. The timing of this dying process has specific historical implications. The Middle Kingdom pyramids at the southern end of the Ahrimat branch chain, built approximately 2000 to 1150 BCE, several centuries after the Great Fourth Dynasty monuments, show valley temple orientations slightly modified from the classic Old Kingdom formula in ways that may reflect a shallower and less reliably navigable branch by that era. The later New Kingdom pharaohs abandoned pyramid construction entirely, shifting to the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. Whether the drying of the Ahrimat branch and the consequent loss of the construction logistics that it enabled was a contributing factor in this architectural transition is a hypothesis that the research opens rather than resolves, but it is a hypothesis that the geology now makes it possible to seriously investigate. The research team's publication of their findings in May 2024 in Communications, Earth and Environment was accompanied by an extensive supplementary data release, the full radar satellite imagery, the geophysical survey profiles, the sediment core logs and dating results, that allows independent researchers to evaluate the evidence and extend the analysis to portions of the branch that the original survey did not cover in detail. The peer review process for the paper involved independent evaluation by geological and archaeological experts who assessed the methodology, the data quality, and the interpretation, and found them scientifically sound. GoName's assessment of what the discovery opens, in terms of research questions that the Ahrimat branch now makes it possible to ask more precisely, focuses particularly on the identification of unknown archaeological sites along the former course. An active river running alongside 31 pyramid complexes for over 1,000 years would have supported a substantial associated population: harbor workers, boat crews, administrative personnel, managing the construction supply chains, merchants and traders moving goods along the branch between pyramid sites and the broader Nile network. The settlements and facilities of this population, their houses, their temples, their workshops, their storage facilities, are archaeologically unknown but physically present somewhere along the branch's 64-kilometer course, buried under the same agricultural fields and desert sand that concealed the branch itself. The mapped course of the branch provides a survey corridor for finding them, and the combination of SAR satellite imagery, ground, penetrating radar, and targeted sediment coring that revealed the branch can be applied to finding the sites along its banks. The discovery of the Ahrimat branch represents a specific kind of scientific breakthrough that is relatively rare. Not the incremental refinement of an existing understanding, but the identification of a previously missing element that makes a previously incomplete picture suddenly coherent. For 200 years, the location of the pyramids on the Western Desert Plateau was an anomaly in the geographic logic of Egyptian civilization. A magnificent anomaly, one that generated endless fascination and speculation, but an anomaly nonetheless. A civilization that built everything else it built adjacent to the Nile, that organized its entire agricultural and administrative system around river access, that used water transport for every major construction and logistics operation, had apparently built its most ambitious monuments in a location without any obvious connection to water. The Ahrimat branch resolves the anomaly completely and cleanly. The pyramids are where they are because the Ahrimat branch was there when they were built. The valley temples are river harbors. The causeways are loading ramps. The 31 monuments strung along 64 kilometers of desert plateau are the legacy of a construction program organized around a major waterway that the Nile's gradual abandonment of the western bank buried under 2,000 years of silence. The biggest secret in Egypt was not hidden in a sealed chamber beneath a pyramid. It was hidden in the sediment beneath the fields of the Nile Valley, where a river that built civilization had been lying buried since the pharaohs walked the earth. It took a radar satellite and a scientist who knew how to read the signals coming back from the ground to finally see it. 200 years of the greatest open question in Egyptology, 64 kilometers of answer, buried 40 miles long beneath the desert sand. Subscribe. Because the sediment cores are still being processed, the 64 kilometers of former riverbank have barely been touched by archaeological survey, and the settlements that supported the pyramid builders' river highway are out there waiting to be found.